Hello and welcome back to another episode of Beyond the To-Do List. I'm your host, Erik Fisher, and this is the show where we talk to the people behind the productivity. This week I'm excited to bring to you a conversation I had with Erik Tivers, host of the ADHD Rewired podcast, as part of October being ADHD Awareness Month. We are going to talk about ADHD and the ways that hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattentiveness that are all symptoms of that, and how those can wreak havoc on your productivity. But not only that, how to better understand yourself or others with those tendencies, even if you do not have a diagnosis of ADHD. This week, it is my privilege to welcome another Erik to the show, Erik Tivers. Erik, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Erik. I'm really happy to be here.
So I had to restart and do a couple different weird things, but that should be no surprise because we're going to talk about ADHD. And in fact, your podcast is called the ADHD Rewired podcast. Although that's probably more words that's actually in the show itself. See, it's already kicking in. Dang it. Anyway,
keep it in.
So people that listen to this show should know this by now that like I have this, was diagnosed a long time ago. I've had a number of people on to talk about this, including Ryan McRae and more recently, a few weeks ago, Peter Shankman. But I thought having Erik on would make a lot of sense because you can really speak to more of the depth and awareness of the issue. And, it'd be nice to have yet another flip or perspective on this issue when it comes to, especially when it comes to productivity, because that's a lot of what you talk about is specific. I mean, you do a whole podcast on this topic. So yeah.
So I've been doing the podcast for over I started it in March of 2014, and having ADHD and being able to, I'm nearing 200 episodes. I've only missed one episode, and it was only because I uploaded the wrong file. Like it was actually had an episode ready to go on the week that I missed, but I moved, and that can create all other kinds of challenges with ADHD because routine and environment is so important for all of us, especially when we have ADHD.
So for those who maybe haven't listened to previous episodes or who aren't entirely sure what ADHD is, especially in adults, what is it specifically? What's the best way to describe it and or categorize it?
There's the sort of the story version of what it is, which I like to use, but then there's also the clinical definition of what it is, which I also like to use because both are really important. Starting with more of that clinical definition, there's sort of three components to it. It's attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And that encompasses three core features. You have your hyperactivity, you have your impulsivity, and then you have your symptoms of inattention. And I think that the area of inattention, this is often an area that is missed with a lot of people, and many people who get diagnosed in adulthood and are missed as kids. It's because they have the ADHD without the H. And some people call it ADD. Clinically speaking, it's ADHD, predominantly inattentive presentation. I don't write the stuff. I just report on it. So there's
let me stop you there. So you are, and you're, by the way, uniquely qualified to speak on this topic on this podcast because you have some credentials in this area.
Yes. Besides just having ADHD after my name, I also have LC established. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So I have a master's degree plus, a bunch of other hours that leads towards clinical supervision and all that. So I'm a therapist in private practice, but I primarily do group coaching online. So I didn't learn that I had ADHD personally until I almost failed out of college. And I think that part of the education around ADHD is so important because when we understand like what's going on in the brain, it starts to make a lot of sense, right? My freshman year of college, my first semester, I got a 2.2, which, I considering I didn't really open the books, it actually wasn't so bad. But then my second semester, I what my parents were threatening to pull me out of school. So I said, oh crap, I better open up the books and study. And I did. And I got a 1.8.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huge improvement.
I figured, something's not right. And I just happened to, sort of timing and luck. I had a dinner with someone who I was talking to, and she was telling me that she was recently diagnosed with ADHD, and she was telling me about it. And it was sort of one of those like big light bulb moments where it's like, that's what ADHD is. And I remember the one thing that she said, and this is so common for people with ADHD. She said, one of the things that she struggled with was reading. And not that she didn't know how to read, that she would be reading and then her mind would wander because something she read would trigger a thought. And now she's thinking about that thought while continuing to read. And now that thought triggers 2 more thoughts, and she's continuing to read. Now she just got to the end of a chapter and she has no idea what she read, but she just read the required reading, so she's done. And I remember thinking I could have said those exact words because that was my experience too.
Yeah, I've had similar experiences to that.
And I remember, so my sophomore year, I got diagnosed at the very beginning of the school year. I was able to convince my parents to give me one more chance. And that's also what tends to be a feature of ADHD is we can be pretty convincing when we are passionate about something. So I got one more chance at school, and thank goodness that I did. I went in for an evaluation, and the psychiatrist that did the evaluation was surprised that I was never identified in school because, I wasn't really hyperactive, but I was kind of off the charts when it came to the inattentive features of ADHD. And these are the things that are, the disorganization, the difficulty with details, the difficulty with time awareness and time management, the difficulty with remembering those things that you need to do, and difficulty with getting yourself to do the work when it's boring. If you're interested in it, no problem. Focus is great.
Yeah.
Right. But if it's boring or tedious or you don't really know why you have to do it, it can be sometimes truly impossible to get your brain to activate enough to get that work done.
So a lot of what you're talking about right now, though, or the symptoms that you're listing and explaining feel familiar probably to a lot of people who don't have ADHD, partly because maybe they either don't have it or they do have it and they aren't diagnosed. But I want to differentiate those people that have it versus those that do, with the disclaimer that we all have these issues. We all struggle with, well, if the work's not fun, it's kind of hard to focus on and stay attentive to it. Kind of an issue, especially with modern day technology, which we don't really have to go into, but we can later if we want to. The issue I'm trying to get at is it feels almost like if that background noise in your brain, so to speak, for a normal person is, say, a 1 to a 3, depending upon what it is, for someone with ADHD, that's turned up to 6 to 9 or more.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And the thing that I want to say, because it's usually when I hear someone say that, everyone has ADHD, the first thing I do is I take a deep breath. Okay. And the reason is because when you have ADHD and you hear someone say that, it's invalidating to your experience. But I also, on the same token, I can understand why someone might say that because, everybody has some of the features that are associated with ADHD sometimes, right? Everybody can be forgetful sometimes. Everybody procrastinates sometimes. Everyone says something that they probably shouldn't have said sometimes. And this is the key. The ADHD is not a sometimes disorder, right? This impacts every domain of our life, right? And it follows us everywhere. It's not just because we're in a bad work situation, and so we're kind of tuning out or we're stressed and, whatever it may be. This doesn't happen just in adulthood, right? This is something that is a neurobiological disorder of development. Like the ADHD brain, we can see through functional MRI imaging scans of our brain that the brain actually physiologically is different.
So in other words, you can't escape it because it's part of you.
Right. And it's, and it's frustrating too, because people with ADHD often they wrestle with this issue of, well, I don't want to blame it, everything on my ADHD or use it as an excuse. And, and I say, neither do I. And you shouldn't use it as an excuse, but it is a place to begin with understanding. And I think a difference between understanding that you may have ADHD and using it as an excuse, the difference is, oh, sorry, I'm late, I have ADHD. Like, that's an excuse.
Right.
And it's like, if you're trying to make it as an understanding, say, I'm sorry that I'm late. I'm really working on this. There's no excuse for it. Here's what I'm doing to try to make up for it.
Yeah.
Right. It's owning that. Or it's if you have a friend and they're frustrated with your lateness, it's if you just tell them to tell you whatever the real time your meeting is, just convince you that it's 15 minutes before the actual time.
Yes.
Right. It's in part of this issue with ADHD is, clinically it's referred to as time myopia, which is a fancy way of saying you can't see time into the future the way everybody else does.
Interesting. That's cool. It almost makes it sound like you're a time traveler.
Well, it's more like I'm time blind.
Yes, it's time blindness, really. But that's so interesting to me, huh?
Right. I mean, and if you're time blind, and here's the thing, that the secret to all of this is the strategies that work really well for people with ADHD also tend to just be awesome productivity strategies.
Right. See, and that's the cool thing for anybody who's listening who doesn't have it, in the same way that, when Peter Shankman was talking about tapping into the ADHD brain in his new book, he was talking about, hey, if you have it, here's how you cope with it. Here's how you not just cope with it, but like lean into it. It's a superpower. I use it as a superpower, he says. But
right. And some people think that.
Yeah.
I have a different take on it.
Yeah.
I think that the idea of calling ADD or ADHD a gift, I think a couple things on this. If it's a gift, why would insurance companies then reimburse for the treatments that are helpful for ADHD? It's like, have fun with your gift. Like, we're not paying for that. So that's one perspective of it. Two, I think that people with ADHD, but also just like other people, we have gifts, right? We have to learn how to manage it and learn how to work in, I forget who phrased the zone of genius.
Oh, I just read that book, or listened to it, I should say. Oh gosh, give me 2 seconds. I will be able to pull it up. It is Gay Hendricks.
Okay. Yeah. What was his books? The Big Leap?
The Big Leap is the book. Okay. So Gay Hendricks, I know this from Cliff Ravenscraft. He's the one who's telling everybody to read this right now. And the book is called The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. And he has in there phrases like the zone of competence, zone of excellence. Cliff's all on about the zone of genius. And there's also something in there called Einstein time, which makes me feel like time blindness a little bit. Anyway.
So, yeah, I mean, just looking at the when you have ADHD, like, first of all, I think it's way easier to be an adult with ADHD than it is to be a kid with ADHD. Because, like, and I think this is an important point. And I know that this is mostly for an adult audience, but ADHD is also really genetic. So consider the fact that for listeners, if they're identifying with some of these things and you have kids, it's genetic. I thank my dad for my ADHD. But looking at this idea of zone of genius and I don't think that it is a superpower. I think that there are things that we may be good at because of our outside the box thinking, but some of that is also adaptive, right? Like if we've struggled with following the rules and doing things in a systematic way, sometimes we adapt and sort of figure out our own ways of doing things, and channeled and supported, that could be an asset. I do pretty well as a business owner. I haven't done so well as an employee, right? So it's
Yeah.
looking at what you're good at and really trying to, I have this belief that when you have ADHD, you have to kind of bend the world to you. And for people that don't have ADHD, that might sound really selfish, right? Like bend the world to you, that's kind of rude, right? But when you have ADHD, it's this idea of, well, just try harder. It's like when we look at functional MRI scans of people doing sort of boring cognitive tasks, and you compare people with ADHD and those without ADHD. When you look at an MRI scan, a functional MRI scan, it shows sort of the brain in action. And the scans that show a lot of stuff lighting up, that's the brain that's working really hard, right? So when you look at these boring cognitive tasks that are not inherently interesting, you see all kinds of regions of the brain lighting up and firing when it really shouldn't be. So when you think about, one of the most, I think, shaming words that is used in what really is ADHD is calling someone lazy. And it's not only shaming, it's not accurate, because the person with ADHD is often working 2 or 3 times harder than the person without ADHD. But from a behavioral standpoint, and we still define it behaviorally based on what we can observe. From a behavioral standpoint, it might look like laziness.
Right.
But it's not. It's not. Like, laziness is not, thinking about that task that you need to do every day where it's weighing on you and not being able to get started on that task. That is called executive dysfunction. And that's a part of ADHD. Really, if we look at the brain's, our brain has all these different responsibilities, right? And one of our brain's responsibilities is to use what's called our executive functions. And this is our sort of our oldest, our newest sort of brain function. This has to do in the area of our prefrontal cortex, the latest, from an evolutionary standpoint, the latest developed area of the brain. So our executive functions are those neurocognitive things that are involved with planning, organizing, task initiation, sustaining your focus, inhibiting distraction that is not related to your focus. Those things that are responsible for goal-oriented behavior. Executive function is also part of our emotional self-regulation, right? Because we need to have a little bit of emotion to get ourselves activated to do stuff. Right. And often in ADHD, like the stuff that says, oh, you have to pay this bill, it doesn't register in our brain enough to take action. So these are these executive functions. And I've heard some people use this idea of a cognitive sort of budget, I think the phrase was, where this idea that when you use your executive functioning skills, you're in those executive function tasks, right, you drain that resource throughout the day. So it's, who was it that said it? Was it Roy Vaden that said willpower is not on will call?
He's probably said something close to that for sure. Yeah.
But that's part of the issue. Is willpower, is been incorrectly identified as a character trait. Right.
Yeah.
And it's not. It is it's neurological. Like willpower, motivation too is neurological.
Yeah.
Right?
There's I'm trying to think to where I've heard more of this. I know that John Acuff has talked about this a bit a while ago. It's also the secret behind the idea of why, for example, Steve Jobs and the black turtleneck and jeans, because, he wanted to eliminate his decisions so that he could keep them for the most important things.
Yes. And it's so spot on. I mean, I've been transitioning more to I guess you can say a uniform versus just a wardrobe, because I don't want to have to figure out what goes together, because I'm horrible at it anyways. So I just want to go, okay, long sleeve or short sleeve. That's what I want my options to be.
Right. Yeah. Here's my 5 shirts for the work week.
Right.
Done.
Because those decisions, like our brain doesn't sort of budget the important decisions and the non-important decisions. It's all the same. So a really weighty decision can be just as taxing on your brain as lots of really insignificant ones.
Yeah. Yeah. They all add up. It's like, those penny decisions.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking cognitive budget, those penny decisions add up into dollars, and those dollars add up, into hundreds of dollars. So
right. And I do this in so many different ways in my life. It's like from breakfast, I switch off every other day from it's either protein shake or oatmeal with fruit and berries, like a high protein oatmeal. Right. It's every other day. It's one of those two things. I don't have to think about it. I like them both. I get the nutrition that I need. Right. I think I mentioned before about the idea of like you have to return someone's call and you're thinking about it and thinking about it. Eric, I'm so bad at returning phone calls and it's not something I'm happy about with myself. Like it makes me feel bad. Right. So what I have done when I was mentioning having to sort of bend the world to you around your ADHD, the way I do that with phone calls is when someone calls me and on my business line, the voicemail message that they are going to hear says something to the tune of, please don't leave me a message, but go to my website and schedule a call with me. Because if it's on my calendar, it's done. It'll happen.
Yep.
Right?
Same thing. Yeah, I've gotten way better with that myself.
And so I just got tired of having what I refer to as the shouldy thoughts. I should be able to return that call, right? There's something that is hard for me to do that. Okay. Now, there are people listening right now who are probably scratching their head, like, really? Like, it's your business? You can't return that call? And I said, I wish that it wasn't so hard. And I know there are probably people listening who are also going, I have the same struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because I think that there are many people who discover ADHD through trying to learn how to be more productive because they're struggling with it. Right? Because in a lot of ways, ADHD is a disorder that impacts our productivity.
I think we probably described it. Described or talked about and given context enough. Like, now that we've got an understanding, what are the strategies that will work for adults with ADHD and for those that don't have it?
Sure. The first thing is we have to assume that we have CRS, can't remember stuff. Okay. And so if you live by the idea of you whatever it is you think you're going to remember, you're not going to, and you write it down. Like, get key information out of your head. And this is something that David Allen in Getting Things Done definitely had to write. It's like, don't try to remember things, right? Like, because it's even if you can remember it, does not mean you should remember it. So capture everything. I think that's one of the primary rules to start is remember that you don't remember. Okay. Keeping things in sight is also really important because we are very cued by our environment, which, and the negative side, that leads us down a lot of rabbit holes, right? But if we set our environment up to support us, when we have the alarms and the notifications and the sticky notes and all those kinds of things that remind us, what do we need to be doing right now? That's going to help us. Like for me, I have 3 screens, computer screens at my desk, and one, I always have my calendar open, right? Because I will forget what I'm doing in the next hour. So I continuously check my calendar. Other strategies, are around self-care, like working late. And so here's one of these things I'll say right now, like, don't do what I say, not what I do kind of thing. Because last night I was up way too late and I feel it. My brain is a little bit more scattered today. Like I can feel that as we're having this conversation. Right. And so don't try to stay up late to get more work done. It's counterproductive. And exercise.
Well, the staying up late thing real quick, the staying up late thing, like we think like even I did it last night for like a half hour. I was just like, oh, I got to do this. And it's going to take me an hour, or no, it's going to take me, it was a thing where it should have taken me 10, 15 minutes. It took me about a half hour because it was late in the day and it was, the kids were asleep, and I was like, I want to have this done so that when I wake up in the morning, it's already done. And and part of it was like looking ahead at the week and stuff like that I had kind of pushed back over and over again all day, just for certain reasons, and not a procrastination type thing. It was literally like other stuff came up, and I was like, cool, I'll roll with it. And I am glad that I did it, but I just knew that, like, you know what? It's like here's exactly the equivalency of it. It was like, okay, I'm hungry now, and I am nowhere near home to eat something healthier / cheaper. So I'm going to go for the more expensive and less healthy fast food because I have to have something now. Just knowing that that's not going to be normal, So
what'd you eat?
Oh, no. I didn't eat. I didn't literally eat. I was just metaphorically, I was.
I missed that metaphor turn somewhere. So we were just metaphor. Okay.
So
this is why you want to sleep more.
Exactly. So I was giving up. Like, instead of getting ready for bed and getting myself better sleep, which again, in hindsight would have been the better way to have gone. I really did decide, and rightfully so, decide to stay up, or postpone my evening rituals and routines by about a half hour, even though it should have only taken me 10, 15 minutes to do the thing. It took me longer because it was late in the day and I was tired and I'd already used up so much of my cognitive budget, and I was just physically tired. But again, I'm glad that I had it done, because then this morning I was like, okay, I have momentum and I can keep going faster and better. So.
Yeah, and it's honestly, it's something that I still struggle with, is like getting to bed on time. It's one of those things where it's like, I know how important it is. A strategy that I actually use, because as an entrepreneur, there's always more to do, right? And so there's that tendency to work late. So I'm married and I have a son, and I love my family. And so I use that as a motivator to get me home. And the way I do that is because I often will work late. And so my son and my wife are already sleeping by the time I get home. And my wife will set an alarm for me at a specific time that if I'm not home in time to shut that alarm off, it is going to wake my family and I am going to be in the doghouse.
Oh, that's good.
And it works because what it does is it activates. It's like, oh, the bomb's going to go off. Go. Right. And like, for me, that's like, that's the difference between, I need to be home by 9 o'clock. Or if I'm not home at 9 o'clock, it's going to wake my family and that's going to be on me. Right. That second version, that gets me out of my chair and gets me home.
Yeah, that's great to have a built-in like consequence that like, oh gosh, everything will fall apart if I don't stop and go.
Right, because the consequence is also more immediate, and that's also a ADHD strategy, because the ADHD brain does not internalize consequence as well as a non-ADHD brain, which is why often we make the same mistakes over and over and over again. Another sort of strategy to look at is having to do with that idea of time blindness, right? So if you're time blind, we have to sort of bypass our sense of time and go right towards seeking time wisdom. And so what I do when I'm working with my clients, and I do a pretty intensive group coaching program. It's online, and one of the things that we do throughout this entire group is we look at the tasks that we have to do and make a prediction about how long that task you think will take you, and actually write down that prediction and actually track it by setting a timer that starts at 0 and goes up. So you can really get a sense of how off you tend to be, right? Because then you can put on, it's sort of like Google Translator, right? It's like put on your ADHD translator. Right. So this task that I'm like, every part of me thinks this is going to take 20 minutes. Like that means it's about a 40-minute task. Right. So it's learning to sort of adapt that. Then the other thing is having timers and clocks everywhere. This idea of, I don't need to wear a watch. I have my phone, right? And when was the last time you took out your phone to check the time? Oh, I got a Facebook message. Now you're looking at that, and the reason you're looking to check the time because you need to leave, and now it's 10 minutes past the point that you needed to leave because you got sucked into a rabbit hole online.
Yep. That's happened to me. That is, though some people will say, man, why would you want to wear an Apple Watch? Because then you'll just get pings on your wrist all the time. It's like, no, I've actually got it dialed way back to where I only get like one or two certain things. And then it's actually a watch that I'm wearing and it tells me the time and actually has timers on it that like, it's like I can say, okay, I have to do this in 20 minutes. And then I tap the 20-minute timer, Yeah,
no, and things just like using things like Siri, right, to start a timer. Anything that you could do that makes something as close to one step as possible, because the more steps that are involved, that's involved sequencing, right? And sequencing is an executive function, and so if we're putting something off or we're having a hard time getting started on something, often one of the issues is we don't really know or see what that first step is. So breaking things down to the most bite-size, component possible is so helpful. Erik, do you ever get what I just refer to as stuck on the couch?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, this happens to me sometimes where I'm just stuck. It's like I refer to it as being stuck in neutral. Like my engine's revving, but I'm not going anywhere. Like I know what I got to do, but my brain is just not kicking it into gear to get myself going. And maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I was having one of those stuck on the couch moments. I was actually stuck on the bed, and I was talking with my wife, and I was just telling her, I'm like, I have so much to do, and I'm stuck. I can't get myself going. And she was half joking, but it was turned out to be a really good strategy. She's like, okay, lift your right leg. And I'm like, okay,
right.
I can lift my right leg. She's like, now lift your left leg. And like that turned out to really work. Like when you're feeling stuck, like, okay, so you have to go, do this big project and you're stuck in the chair. Like, don't think about the big project. Think about what are the actual micro steps to getting yourself off the couch.
This is funny because this ties into what we were talking about prior to hitting record, which was that I had literally just switched over to a different wireless, a batteryless, I should say, batteryless Apple keyboard and mouse for my desk situation here. Mm-hmm. And it was because I had the open opportunity because I was selling my old computer and I was throwing in the keyboard and mouse to a friend of mine. And so I could kind of cover the cost of upgrading. But it was then like, no, I'm going to upgrade because all I have to do is plug in a cord. All I have to do is plug in a cord and those charge via lightning cord. Whereas, and there you go, that's that one step. Whereas with the old system, it was take batteries out of keyboard, take batteries out of mouse, put batteries in charger, put charger in wall, leave in wall long enough to charge, then pull the battery and then reverse, like 3 to 4 more steps. And I may seem like I'm making this a crazy thing, but we don't take stock of the fact that the cognitive bandwidth or how much the strung together minor tasks, what one person would call recharging the batteries for your keyboard or mouse, someone else is going to say, or have it broke down into this accordion folder of multiple different steps that they've got to do. It's crazy.
Yes. It's and even if something like that isn't a struggle for you, understanding that you can get even more cognitive bandwidth by thinking through the things that you do each day.
Yes.
How do I reduce the steps? How do I reduce decision making? How do I, systemize and automate? Like all those things are going to just create more available resource for you to do more stuff.
Totally. Yeah. And see, that's where my mind was for a long time, prior to even being diagnosed. Then when I was like, oh, well, I'm going to lean into this even more so.
And the other thing too, and I haven't even mentioned, it's when we look at what the evidence-based treatment for ADHD is, it does include medication, and and the frontline treatment for ADHD is stimulant medication. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of people who will say, oh, I don't want to do medication. It's I just want to try harder. And to that, I would say you probably all are already trying really, really hard. And what I say, people ask me, are you pro or meds or anti-meds? I'm like, I'm pro trying meds, because if they can work for you, if they can provide some sense of leveling the playing field for you, right? Like, why wouldn't you try that, right? Like, now there are people who don't have a good response to it. Although most people do. That's why but it's pills do not teach skills. When I was in college and I first started taking medication for my ADHD. Well, first of all, when I said at the beginning of the show about reading, right? That was I remember this moment. So it was such a pivotal moment in my life. I kind of view my life as pre this moment and post this moment. It was the first time taking medication. And I sat down to read. I was a sociology minor, and there was a ton of reading in these courses. And I was reading this book called Crested Kimono. It was about the Japanese comparative family system. And the fact that I remember that is significant, right? Like, this is the first time in my life, a sophomore year in college, that I read an entire chapter of a book, and I knew what I had just read. Like, I stayed focused on what I had just read. And I just remember having this moment of, oh my gosh, like, if I would have known, growing up, that this is what was going on, like, my schooling would have been, my life would have been a different story up to that point.
Yeah.
Right. And so I went from a year getting a 2.0 to I got a 3.75 that first semester on medication. And throughout the rest of my college, I didn't get anything lower than a 3.5. Right. And, to me, I felt normal for the first time. And it's an experience that a lot of people describe, not everyone, but a lot of people describe when they first try medication. And, so I would tell people, your listeners, if you're resonating with what I'm saying here and you're like, oh, that's ADHD. And one of the challenges is that unfortunately there's a lot of poorly educated doctors in this area. Right. So you have to really find a specialist, because you'll still find professionals who say, I don't believe in ADHD. And it kills me when I hear that, because there is more research around ADHD than there is in any other disorder in all of behavioral health. It's kind of insane. Like, we think about, we don't know the long-term effects to what the stimulant medication does. That's incorrect. Like, stimulant medication has been used since the late early 1940s, when a doctor decided let's try to treat, these hyperactive boys with stimulants. And this was in a hospital, and the nursing staff there was threatening to resign because they thought this was the craziest idea they've ever heard. Within that same day of these kids taking the medication, they were calm. They were focused. They were able to do their schoolwork. So we do know the long-term effects of these medications, right? And when they're used as directed and followed by a doctor who knows what they're talking about and knows their stuff, like, they're safe and effective. And I got to tell you, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation if it were not for this ADHD medication. I still take it today, but it does not teach you the skills. Like, it helps you focus. It's not going to help you figure out what to focus on. Because when I was in college, I was the hardest working, least efficient student there was.
Yeah. That's awesome. Erik, it's been great talking with you today.
Yeah.
I want people who really want to dig deeper on this, either because they have it or because they know they can learn from those that have it. What is it that you talk about on your show?
The core of my show, it's stories, science, and strategies. I believe very strongly that we need to bring an empirical, evidence, research-based message, because there's a lot of snake oil out there around ADHD. But I also know how boring that could be for most people, right? So I dress that up in people's stories, and I invite people on my show to tell their story. So I have everyday people with ADHD. I also have a lot of experts, from coaches to clinicians to some of the premier research experts in the field. So I think it's a very accessible show. It's very casual. It runs the mill. This is what ADHD sounds like. You'll hear tangents, you'll hear interruptions, but I think you'll also hear that you're not alone. And I think that's what so many people have shared with me, which is such a motivating thing for me to keep going, is that people who thought that they were the only ones who thought this way or struggled this way, they realize that they're not alone. And I think when it comes down to it, that's what we all crave, is that sense of belonging, knowing that we're not alone, because when you feel like you're the only one struggling with this, the shame that we go through. And if any of your listeners are familiar with Brene Brown, like I talk a lot about her work on the show and the importance of separating things like productivity from our self-worth, dealing with perfectionism, and these are things that people share very vulnerably on my podcast, ADHD Rewired. And so it's a chance for people to really tune in to hear and tap into a community where they feel understood, and it's a very growth minded. So it's not just let's just all complain about our problems and how much it sucks to return phone calls, right? It's okay, like yes, it's hard to return phone calls. Hey, what are you doing? What's helping you, right? So I think hearing the Me Too with a growth minded approach is really what we do on the podcast. And I have a whole online community on Facebook. And then I also have online coaching groups that we do about 3 times a year that are really intense and have really become kind of my bread and butter for how I work, right? Like I shifted from being a traditional therapist where I see clients in my office to really doing this group coaching 3 times a week. I pair people with accountability partners. And that's another piece of strategies for our ADHD is we got to have accountability. So that's all ADHD Rewired. It's
awesome.
It's the coaching, the podcast, the community. That's what it is.
And where can people find it?
And they can find it the same place you found this podcast. So your podcast, Apple Podcast, come over to my website, ADHDrewired.com. You can learn more about my coaching services, about the podcast. I have show notes there. They can learn more about everything there. So definitely I'd love to have you as a listener if you are interested in this. And Erik, thanks so much for having me on and letting me talk with your audience about ADHD.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So I hope you're walking away from this episode with a deeper or better understanding of ADHD and the people around you that may have it, or honestly, just that extra added dimension of impulsivity and inattentiveness and even hyperactivity that also come along with or are exacerbated by, symptom-wise, our technology and our devices. I urge you to check out Erik's podcast, the ADHD Rewired podcast. You can find that in any podcast directory of choice that you use. I'd also like to say thank you to the sponsors for this episode. FormStack. Make sure to go to formstack.com/beyond for a free trial and to receive a promo code for 25% off your first 3 months. ZipRecruiter. Try ZipRecruiter if you are hiring over at ziprecruiter.com/beyond. And BarkBox. If you have a dog in your life, whether it's yours or someone you know and you're very fond of it, get an extra month free with your 6 to 12 month plan by going to barkbox.com/beyond. Thanks again for listening. If you know of someone who would benefit from listening to this episode, make sure to share it with them. And with that, I will see you next episode.